Let's give a warm welcome to Sherveen Uduwana, who is our next speaker. Sherveen is an award-winning designer who has worked on games Puzzle Platformer from the Lights and also We Are the Caretakers. We Are the Caretakers is an Afrofuturist game that centralizes around saving endangered animals from aliens. And now his current game, Mid-Autumn, is about blasting evil spirits and resisting gentrification. So yeah, I don't know if it should come as a surprise that his talk is going to be about introducing chaos into your narratives effectively. So, without further ado, let's welcome him to the stage.
Hi everyone, welcome to Introducing Chaos. Let's build some procedural narrative systems. I'm Sherveen. That's my social media if anyone wants to follow me on Twitter. And a little bit about me. My pronouns are he, him. I make games. I also teach games with Code Coven, and I'm also making Mid-Autumn. So that is, by the way, coming to Steam Early Access next year, May 9th. Please go wishlist it. I really appreciate it. But let's actually get into the talk. So this is really just like a mental model that like I have for building procedural narrative systems. It's not the only one way to make things, so please don't treat it as gospel or anything like that. It's just a very opinionated talk. And the reason I like this approach is just I find it simple, easy to kind of like remember for me. And yeah, I hope it helps folks be able to make more procedural narratives and procedural storytelling systems because I want to play them. So that's purely selfish on me. So I've always really loved procedural storytelling, procedural narrative. I find that the ability to create surprise and also that like specificity of being able to tell the player, oh, we see you are reacting to what you did in the game just now. I find that very, very compelling. And I also like that kind of removing this agency and creating this like procedural elements kind of disincentivizes this need for us as players to kind of optimize everything about the game and lets our curiosity kind of take hold. So I think that's also a fun aspect of them. What I don't really find when I'm making procedural systems is that they save me time. I think that when we find like, you know, ways to save time in parts of our development pipeline, we often just replace that with more ambitious projects or doing other things. So I don't find that it saves time or allows me to kind of like hide bad writing or anything. It's not cheaper really in practice. And I think that when you're making authored content, you really only have to understand it like well enough to just make it. But when you're making procedural content, you have to understand it well enough to explain it to a computer. So that makes it a lot harder to like you have to really, really know what makes a good level or what makes a good narrative in your game in order to create a procedural system for it. So don't do it if you're trying to save time, basically. Um, yeah, so this kind of leads me to this thought that I find that procedural systems are still very highly authored. We're still making a lot of creative decisions with them. And the magic trick I find is in finding the most satisfying, compelling points in your narrative or in your game to kind of loosen your grip and let some kind of chaos occur. I think that's very fun when that happens and is done correctly. So when I'm trying to build procedural systems in general, I want to make them as dumb as I can get away with. The dumber they are, the easier they are for me to hold in my mind and kind of think about. I want to be able to show cause and effect clearly to the player. Because I think that like when a player can see that they did something and it has an effect, I think that creates the impression of a more complex system than true complexity. So in that sense, I also kind of want to fake complexity rather than actually having complexity as much as possible. So that folks feel like, wow, what a cool complex system that's like reacting to me. But I don't actually have to do that because that will, blow up our production schedule. And when you're dealing with procedural content, I think a good metric is that your worst case scenarios, the worst things that can happen or be generated, should be acceptable. They should work within your framework for what a good narrative is or what a good level is or anything like that. And your best case scenarios should be exceptional. So that's what I'm always trying to hit when I'm trying to make a procedural system. And on top of that, I also want to make sure it's just not a pain in general to work with. It's not cumbersome. So I want to make it easy to set up, easy when I'm saving data. We'll go into that a bit when we're in engine. I'm thinking about localizing when I'm thinking about narratives. So making sure we can translate it into different languages and making sure that when you have like hundreds and hundreds of events like later on in development, it's still easy to work with. It's not a huge pain. So that's like what I was thinking about in general with procedural systems. But I think two major kind of things tweaked my sense of how I want to make procedural systems. So in about November of 2020, Hades had come out, and People Make Games released a video on kind of how their dialogue system works. And this was actually, I think, probably the thing that made me go, oh, it's time to make Mid-Autumn, because I had like this click moment where I was like, oh, this is much simpler than I'd actually considered. Because, for folks who don't know, Hades, it's a narrative-driven roguelite, and every time you talk to characters in that game, you're getting slightly different dialogue. It's out of order, but it still has a really, really strong sense of voice and character for all of these people you're interacting with. So the idea that this is done in a much simpler way than I was expecting was a really, really kind of watershed moment for me, I think. And then the second thing that happened was that in about March 2022, I noticed that there was a video on a different game that had come out, which was Wildermyth. Had come out, I think, the year before. And for those who don't know, Wildermyth is like a fantasy XCOM where your characters all kind of start out as kind of normal kind of peasants and farmers, but over time they become these really specific, compelling characters. And Nate Austin, who I think is project lead on that team, made a video on their procedural storytelling approach. I think that this is available for free, like on YouTube, a version of this. I think there's a GDC talk. I don't think that's available yet, but when that is, that's also a really good one to check out. And there was just this really great metaphor that they use of like casting actors for a play that like I found really compelling in terms of this kind of plot-driven structure that exists in this game, as opposed to the kind of character-driven structure in Hades. And so I was thinking about both of these, and I had like a small like epiphany where I was like, oh, okay. So when Hades came out, I was like, oh, this could really be applied to any kind of character-driven games. That's really cool. I think it's a very useful system. And then when Wildermyth came out, I was like, oh, this could be applied to really any event-driven games. And there's other there's other spectrums of ways to like make games, obviously, when you're doing procedural systems. But I realized that you could create kind of a framework, a mental framework that kind of encompasses any style of game. If you go from like more plot driven to more character driven things, that can potentially encompass like any kind of game you want to make. So I think it's a useful model. It was one approach to being able to do this. So what did this actually lead to? So what I kind of refined my thought of what a procedural system needs to be is like simplified it down into it really only needs to be a system that can check for increasingly specific conditions. So 99% of the time, you don't need to check for these conditions. It can just be checking for like one basic thing. But when you want to, you can really dial that up and check for like a really, really specific thing that has only happened maybe to one player. And that's how we are able to tell the player we see you. That's how I'm able to fake complexity. And then I think the second thing is it needs some element of prioritization. So I need to be able to show some high priority events before low priority ones. That's to help with cause and effect. If the player does something and it's really impactful, I want to be able to show an event that speaks to that as soon as possible. And we can make this more explicit with like messaging systems or notifications, but that's a bit outside the scope of the narrative system. And that's pretty much it. Like there's a huge oversimplification. Like I think Wildermyth, for example, doesn't just do this. They also have like the ability to change the actual tone of the dialogue that's happening based on your character's traits. But I think of that as kind of layering multiple systems on top of each other. And I think I'll go into that a bit more as well. So after we've done that, after we have those kind of two basic things, I think the big thing that's still missing is something to hang these procedural elements on. So we need something that is going to stay rigid, that's going to be actually highly authored. And I think the reason why I prefer that is because that is the thing that you use to inject tone, voice, and structure into your game. So I like to imagine like a flower pot, basically, and the flowers and all the cool like kind of stuff that people pay attention to are the kind of procedural elements, the things that we make more fluid to inject kind of surprise, specificity, those kinds of things. But the actual shape and structure of the overall experience is coming from the things that we make rigid. So in Hades, that would be like the characters. They're very highly defined. They speak in a very particular voice. But when and where you speak to them, that can change, and that's very fluid. And in Wildermyth, the things that are very rigid are the actual plot events. So those have a clear beginning, middle, end, and the thing that's fluid is who is in them, what is the actual dialogue that's happening. That's very, very fluid. And so I like to think of that as like the pot that like holds like all your little flowers that come out. And this can actually be made with like surprisingly little code, I find. I think like when I first tried this out, it took me about a week of messing around, and I think now I can set up something like this in a day if needed. And I think there's a lot of opportunity here for narrative direction. So yeah, let's actually build something. I'm going to jump into a game engine in a bit. I'm going to jump into Unity, and we're going to make a farming game. All right, here we are in our game engine. This is Unity 2020. I'm going to go through these kind of quickly, so if folks have questions, feel free to reach out to me like outside of this talk. I'll post these project files for folks to mess around with, and if there's interest for a more thorough breakdown, just let me know. The first thing I did when setting this up was make a simple core loop for this farming game. So you can plant, water, and harvest crops. You can choose between carrots and turnips and then sell them to a shopkeeper for coins, and you'll repeat that over and over, which gives us a lot of opportunities to play our procedural dialogue. So I typically would use royalty-free assets or templates or things like that to get through this part faster, but I took a bit longer with this because I wanted to be able to share these project files with y'all so you can mess around with these and apply them to your own projects. If folks need help with the actual building games part, you're welcome to follow up with me. And this is also a big part of like our intro to games class at Code Coven. So, but designing these procedural systems is kind of like the second step that we build on top of some of the existing gameplay. So let's talk about these systems. So we've got a folder here with the scripts I've made for our procedural narrative systems. We have classes that define what these events actually are. So the high level thing we need to understand about our Storyteller class is that all it's really doing is taking our large pool of all the viable events we can generate, then narrowing that down based on any requirements we've defined. And once we have this pruned, kind of curated subset of our initial character event pool, we don't really care which one we play at this point. We're just going to randomly pick one. So all of these conditions we want are going to be defined in the events themselves. I'll start by focusing on just the character-driven, like Hades-inspired approach, which is being used to generate random dialogue that the shopkeepers are going to say when you sell them produce. So for this, we have two classes, what I'm calling a character beat and a character profile. The character profile is super bare bones here. It's just a name and an ID, but for more complex systems, this could include things like character portraits, voiceover lines, other things tied to the specific character. Then we have our character beat class. So this defines the actual event. So in Unity, I've set these up as scriptable objects, which are just like containers for data. They never need to actually exist in our levels. We're just reading data from them. The basic variables that the class needs are what dialogue occurs in this beat and which character is this beat tied to. You'll see those two variables at the top here. So for example, we have a blue shopkeeper and a red shopkeeper, and they can only be assigned character beats that are associated with their respective character profiles. For this project, I have assumed for simplicity's sake that we've just got one line of dialogue. Essentially, these are character barks, but often in practice, this will be a list of dialogue lines, usually its own class, that also define who's speaking each line. So these are all currently using strings to define the text, but what I'd eventually do when I'm implementing a localization system is swap the strings out with some kind of like localized string class. It's basically going to be more of a key that we're going to use to generate the correct text in the game's currently selected language. The next variables here all have to do with when should this event play. So we have a priority. Right now, this is super binary. It's just like 0 is no priority and 1 is high priority. I don't usually need much more than this, but adding like additional levels of priority isn't difficult. You're just going to need to copy paste some of the logic in our Storyteller class, which I'll point out where we do that. We've got a list of prerequisite milestones. So in the Storyteller class, we're going to have an enumerator variable called milestone. This currently has 3 milestones in it that describe kind of specific events. Like, are we currently friends with the blue shopkeeper? Do we have 500 turnips? Do we have no turnips? The Storyteller class has a list of milestones that are currently active. And all we need to do is make sure this is accurate. So when the conditions are met for the blue shopkeeper to be our friend, we just make sure that milestone is added to our active milestone list. Same for the 0 turnips milestone. We can check the player's current amount of turnips. And when that's true, we add the milestone to our list. When it's not true, we remove it from the list. This is how we get the majority of the system's specificity, because we can use any method we want, really, to add or remove a milestone. We can define any and as many milestones as we want. I think a limitation with enumerators is like we can only have like up to 256 milestones, and it's, I think, slightly slower than just using integers. But because it's like written out, it's much easier for me to read and understand the current state of the game. So I prefer using these. Okay, so we'll move to the next set of variables, which have to do with how does this event affect our future events. So we have a list of character beats to unlock. So when this character beat gets played, like this list gets appended to our list of viable character beats in our Storyteller class. So from this point forward, all of these beats to unlock can be selected when we talk to our shopkeepers as well. We also have a list of milestones to unlock that get added to our Storyteller's active milestones list. Unlocking a milestone based on dialogue, I find, is a pretty common thing. So, like the Are We Friends with the Blue Shopkeeper one, for example, is currently set up to be unlocked when a specific character beat gets played. The last thing here is a unique ID that every character beat, most things in my games, have. So we add this ID to the Storyteller's list of played IDs, so we can assure we're not repeating events. We're just going to check that each time, before we play something. This is also super, super necessary for when we do saving eventually, right? So it's much easier to save a string than a more complex class. So just to generate this ID currently, we're just checking whenever we modify the scriptable object, is the ID variable currently empty? And then I'm just getting like the current system time, adding a big random number to it. And it's practically impossible to get a repeat ID this way. The way it's currently set up, we will have duplicate IDs if we ever kind of duplicate one of our events. And that'll cause some bugs, but mostly I've just remembered to clear the ID and regenerate it when I duplicate things. But you can just add additional checks to prevent that if you want, if that's necessary. So that's kind of how character beats work. Because I've set these up as scriptable objects, and I set it up so there's a menu using this create asset menu line here. We can just right click in our project folder to create a new event, write in what happens, and keep the tone of our characters consistent. For clarity, I've made the personalities very one note. Our blue shopkeeper is very grumpy, and our red shopkeeper is super excitable. And just by tweaking the event's priorities, unlocking new beats and milestones at specific times, we can have moments in our narrative that feel like very linear when we want to, and can be incredibly reactive just by, like, for example, requiring 10 different milestones before it can be played. So yeah, let's run through now how our storyteller is actually getting this event to our shopkeeper. So in our farming NPC class, we have this character profile of the NPC and also a character beat variable that's the current beat that's going to play when we next talk to this character. We have a get next character beat method that is just calling the equivalent method in our storyteller and passing over the character profile of our NPC to that method. So the only addition here is that we're accounting for the edge case where we've played all of our character beats and we don't have any new ones to play. So a lot of the bugs in procedural systems will have to do with what we do when nothing meets our requirements. So in this case, we're just defaulting to the shopkeeper saying a generic thank you when no other events can be found. We're calling this method whenever we've just spoken to the shopkeeper, and also once at the beginning of the game just to set up our first character beat. And then over in our storyteller class, what's happening is we're going into this get random character beat method, which takes a character profile to get started and narrows down our viable pool of character beats. To do this kind of narrowing down process, I'm using this where method that kind of takes a list and provides a subset based on a condition, any condition you can set. So to be able to use this, I'm making use of system.link up at the top of this class. This is technically not like very efficient, but you can achieve the same thing by making like a second list, going through all the elements in our original list, and only adding elements that match our criteria to this new list. In this case, where the beats associated character matches our requested character. I haven't really run into performance issues using this method, since you can generally time when you generate these to be behind a loading screen. So unless you need to be generating these constantly, you can probably just get away with using this method. So again, we're narrowing this down based on the character, based on whether it's been played, based on whether all the prerequisite milestones are contained in our list of active milestones. If there's priority 1 beats in our list, I've narrowed it down even further. And after narrowing it down, if our list has a size greater than 0, we just pick a random element from this curated list and send it back to the farmer NPC class. The other thing here to note is that I have the play character beat method, and that's separate from our get random character beat method. So this is where we actually give the farming NPC the string value to update its dialog box with. Again, when I localize this, we would get this string value from some kind of localized string class. But this is also where we add our ID to played IDs, where we unlock our beats to unlock and milestones to unlock. I basically just want to wait until I know the beat's actually been played, that is like seen by the player, to unlock all these things. I don't want to unlock them right away, because if the player quits the game without seeing that dialogue, or misses the dialogue in some other way, I want to still be able to generate that character beat, so we're not missing out on content. So once we have our character beats and character profiles set up, and the storyteller is like randomly picking from our viable character beat pool and playing that beat for our farming NPCs, then we'll be able to sell crops to the blue and red shopkeepers and progress through their respective character beats over time. We'll have some events here that can only trigger based on like how many turnips you have, or if you've progressed far enough in the blue shopkeeper's dialogue for them to consider you their friend. And yeah, so that explains the character-driven approach, basically, which is similar to how Hades handles things. Let's quickly transfer over to our event-driven approach, which is going to be inspired more by Wildermyth. I don't have time to make full comic strips like Wildermyth does, so I'm just going to tweak this project to allow for some daily events where we harvest our crops. Initially, you can harvest the crops right after watering them, so I'm changing it so that you actually have to sleep and progress to the next day for watered crops to be harvestable. And that's when we'll pick like a random one of these crops to be cast in our daily event. So if we go into our event-driven system folder, I've made a script called Plant Event Beat. Going into the script, it's actually very similar to our character beat. So I'm giving it 3 dialogue lines here, so we can do kind of a beginning, middle, and end to our events. This class very similarly has priority, prerequisite milestones, beats to unlock, milestones to unlock. The main unique thing here is this list of required plant traits. And any plant that we cast in this event is going to need to have all the traits in this list. So I'm jumping into our plant script, which is called Plant Plot. You'll see our plant traits are, again, an enumerator class and includes things like giant, tiny, tasty, bland. This could be anything we want, just based on what sort of events we want to write around. And we're generating the list of like this plant's traits anytime we plant a seed. And I've added some UI elements to tell the player like what traits this plant has as we're watering and harvesting it. So jumping back into our storyteller, the get random plant event beat and the play plant event beat methods are practically identical to what we're doing for our character beats. We're just using a pool of our viable plant event beat classes instead. You could probably merge these into one big pool if you wanted, just by having like a parent class that our plant event beats and character event beats both inherit from. For simplicity, I haven't done that. So the kind of unique code that's related to this event-driven approach is actually in our farmer controller class, so the player controller. This would also fit in a game manager class, but I didn't make one for this project, again, keeping it super lightweight. So when we transition to the next day, we're getting a random daily event, narrowing it down based on priority, milestones, etc., exactly the same way we're doing for the character beats. And then we're getting a list of all the plants in our game. So this is the unique thing. And we're making a subset of the list of all the plants that meet 2 conditions. Is this plant currently in the watered state, meaning it's going to be harvestable when we enter the next day? And does this plant have all the traits required for the event we just generated? So we use that to generate, a curated list of plants that are castable in this event. And then we just pick a random plant in that list and assign our daily event to it. So it'll end up with a little exclamation point, and when you try to harvest it, the text box pops in from the right and plays our event. So in the event that we don't find a daily event, or we don't find any plants that have the required traits, it's just set up so that we don't have an event that day. Again, what happens when no events can be found is really just up to your design sensibility. You can do whatever you want. So with that, we now have this little farm experience. We have character-driven beats that are generated when we talk to our shopkeepers. We have event-driven beats that are generated when we harvest our plants each day. And that's pretty much where I'm going to stop for this talk. There's definitely a lot of additional stuff to talk about with setting these up, but I'm hoping this is plenty for folks to get started thinking about making your own procedural systems. When you're thinking about adding complexity to these, the way I like to think about it is in terms of layering more of these simpler systems on top of each other. Again, because keeping each element simple makes it easier for me to keep in my mental model of the game, and layering them also means you can potentially strip back those layers in moments of your game that you want to feel more authored and linear. Some things we didn't fully explore are going to be like how to actually implement saving, localization, batch importing, like making a large number of these character beats and event beats at once. But what I will do is put the build of this game, as well as project files, links to additional tutorials, on an itch.io page that I'm linking here. Folks are welcome to reach out if you run into issues trying to apply this to your own stuff. And if there's interest, I'm happy to do a follow-up talk where I kind of go into more detail on those elements as well. Yeah, thanks so much for attending this talk. Once again, I'm Sherveen. Here's my social media. Please wishlist my game mid-autumn so I can afford to take the time to do more talks like this in the future. And yeah, if we have any time for questions, I will leave some space for that. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you so much, Sherveen, for that not chaotic talk about chaos. Yes, I got that right. In the meantime, while we are processing, if you have a moment, please give gdocExpo some love. Give us a follow on Twitter, Facebook, and whatever other social media you happen to be on. We would love your support.